He adopted the most hated dog. In the shelter, no one expected what happened next. "Get away from him! Leave the dog alone!" Werner roared, his voice cracking with a mix of fear and fury as the thugs closed in. In the chaotic moments that followed, a quiet street corner transformed into a battlefield. An old man, a brave baker with a cast-iron skillet and a wounded dog named Storm, stood their ground against armed criminals. Just as a gun was pointed at the heroic dog, the piercing wail of police sirens cut through the rain-soaked air. To find out the stunning truth about Storm and what became of these unlikely heroes, subscribe to our channel, like this video, and listen to the full heart-stopping story. The hum was the first thing Dr. Eris Thorne noticed. Not the low, reassuring thrum of the ultrasound machine, but a discordant, high-frequency undertone that seemed to vibrate in his teeth. On the sterile steel table before him, the German shepherd lay in a deep, chemically induced sleep. It had been brought in an hour ago by a frantic old man suffering from a violent full-body seizure of unknown origin. Now, as Eris glided the transducer over the dog's shaved flank, the source of the hum became terrifyingly clear. On the monitor, nestled against the animal's 8th thoracic vertebra, was something impossible. It was not a tumor, not a cyst, not shrapnel. It was a perfect cylinder of a material his machine couldn't identify, about the size of a human thumb. It was clearly artificial, surgically implanted with a precision that bespoke immense skill. As he watched, a tiny rhythmic pulse of blue light emanated from its core, visible even through the monochrome grain of the ultrasound. "What in God's name?" Eris whispered, leaning closer. The moment he moved the transducer for a better angle, the device reacted. The blue light flared, and the low hum escalated into an audible whining buzz. The overhead fluorescent lights in the examination room flickered violently, strobing in perfect sync with the pulse on the screen. The dog, though deeply sedated, let out a pained whimper as its entire body convulsed with each flicker of light, a marionette dancing to an unseen electrical current. Eris snatched his hand back as if burned. The lights stabilized. The hum subsided. He stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had treated dogs mauled by badgers, hit by cars, even one that had swallowed a string of Christmas lights. This was different. This felt alien. This was technology far beyond any veterinary or even human medical implant he had ever seen or read about. He glanced at the dog's intake form clipped to a board on the wall. The scrawled, shaky handwriting of the owner was a stark contrast to the cold, technological precision of the object inside his patient. Owner, Arthur Finch. Dog's name, Shadow. Eris looked from the form to the dog, then back to the ghostly, pulsating cylinder on the monitor. He was a vet. He fixed broken bones and cured infections. He wasn't equipped for this. A cold dread washed over him as he realized he had just stumbled into a world he didn't know existed, and the epicenter of it was lying unconscious on his examination table. Arthur Finch lived his life by the Dewey Decimal System. As a recently retired archivist, his world was one of quiet order, of categorized histories and alphabetized truths. His small stone cottage in the English countryside was a fortress of routine, a defense against the chaotic grief that had lingered since his wife Eleanor had passed away the year before. The silence she left behind was the loudest thing in the house, a constant ringing void that his books and meticulously tended garden could not fill. It was Eleanor who had always wanted a dog. Arthur's allergies had been his lifelong excuse, but now armed with modern antihistamines and a loneliness that had become a physical ache, he decided the time had come. The local shelter was a low, sad building perpetually underfunded and smelling of disinfectant and desperation. A weary manager named Clara showed him pens of yapping terriers and hopeful hounds, but Arthur's gaze was drawn to the back to a reinforced kennel set apart from the others. Inside, a large German shepherd lay on the concrete as still as a statue. Its black and tan coat was dull, marred by a tracery of old scars along its flank and muzzle. It didn't bark, it didn't pace. It just stared at the wall, a portrait of absolute desolation. A small card on the kennel door read, "Shadow. I wouldn't love Clara," said her voice gentle. "That one's broken." She explained that Shadow had been found 8 months prior wandering near the perimeter of the long decommissioned RAF Blackwood research base. He was unresponsive, unpredictable, and had bitten 2 volunteers who had pushed him too hard. He's not a pet, Mr. Finch. He's a ghost. No one's even come close to wanting him. Arthur saw none of that. He saw the proud set of the dog's head, the deep intelligence in its dark almond eyes. He saw a loneliness that mirrored his own. He pulled a wooden stool from a nearby storage closet and simply sat by the kennel, speaking to the dog in the same quiet, cataloging tone he had used for his archives for 40 years. He spoke of Eleanor, of the silence of the roses in his garden. For an hour there was no response. Then slowly the magnificent head lifted. The dog turned, and its eyes met Arthur's. There was no aggression. There was no fear. There was only a profound, heart-stopping flicker of recognition, a silent question passing from one lonely soul to another. Against Clara's strenuous, heartfelt advice, Arthur Finch adopted the dog nobody wanted. The first 48 hours were an exercise in quiet cohabitation. Shadow was a phantom in the cottage, moving with an unnerving silence, his claws never clicking on the old floorboards. He ate what was offered, then retreated to a corner, watchful and still. Arthur maintained his routine, a silent pact of mutual respect. On the 3rd evening, as Arthur sat reading in his worn armchair, he heard a low whine. He found Shadow in the living room, standing over Eleanor's favorite wingback chair. The dog was pawing at the floral fabric, a soft, questioning sound deep in its throat. As Arthur approached, expecting him to retreat, Shadow did the unexpected. He turned, nudged Arthur's trembling hand with his cold nose, and held it there. It was the first time the dog had initiated contact. A tear traced a path through the dust of Arthur's quiet life. Later that night, the peace shattered. A harsh, rasping cough echoed from the living room, followed by a sickening thud. Arthur rushed in to find Shadow on the floor, his body rigid, legs kicking spasmodically. A frightening, guttural, choking sound came from his throat as a violent seizure took hold. Panic and emotion Arthur hadn't felt in years seized him. He wrapped the convulsing dog in a blanket, hauled him into his old Volvo, and drove frantically through the winding country lanes, his only thought to reach the faint, distant glow of the region's only 24-hour veterinary clinic. There, a young, sharp-eyed vet named Dr. Eris Thorne met him at the door, his face a mask of professional calm that would soon crumble into disbelief. "This isn't a medical device, Mr. Finch." Dr. Thorne's voice was low-taut, with a nervous energy that unnerved Arthur more than any dire diagnosis could have. In the sterile quiet of the clinic, the ultrasound image on the screen seemed to pulse with a malevolent life of its own. I don't know what it is. A tracker. Data storage. Whatever its function, it's the cause of the seizures. It's interacting with his central nervous system. I've stabilized him for now, but I have no idea how to treat this. Honestly, I don't know who you could even talk to about it. As Thorne spoke, a sleek black van with tinted windows cruised slowly past the clinic's front window. It was unmarked anonymous, yet it radiated a sense of purpose. Shadow, still groggy from the sedatives, lifted his head from the examination table. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound deeper and more threatening than any Arthur had heard from him before. His eyes were fixed on the van until it disappeared down the road. Fear, cold and unfamiliar, pricked at Arthur's skin. He was a retired archivist. His life was about preserving the past, not navigating a dangerous present. He settled the bill, his hand shaking, and took Shadow home. The vet's bewildered face and the image of the black van burned into his mind. In the days that followed, Arthur began to see that Shadow was more than just a dog. His unique, unnerving training surfaced in small, startling ways. During a walk in the woods behind the cottage, a roe deer snapped a twig 50 yards away. Instantly, Shadow didn't bark or give chase. He dropped into a low, silent crouch, his head sweeping the terrain with a fluid, methodical scan of the perimeter that was chillingly professional. One afternoon, Arthur dropped his reading glasses behind a heavy oak bookshelf. As he prepared to strain his back, Shadow nudged him aside. The dog braced his paws against the floor, then used his powerful shoulders and body weight to expertly rock the heavy piece of furniture, not with force, but with a precise, calculated leverage just enough for Arthur to retrieve them. These were not the actions of a normal dog. They were the practiced maneuvers of a highly trained operative. His own research hitting dead ends, Arthur found his thoughts returning to what Clara had said, found near the old RAF Blackwood research base. He drove back to the shelter, finding the weary manager locking up for the night. He didn't know what else to do. He explained what the vet had found describing the implant. Clara's face went white. She unlocked the office and beckoned him inside, her hands trembling as she put the kettle on. "Arthur," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "A few days after he was brought in, a man came to see me. Sharp suit, expensive car. Said he was from a private animal welfare organization and had heard about a new German shepherd. He offered a 5,000-pound cash donation for the shelter if I would let him evaluate the dog privately." She had refused. The man's eyes were cold, his questions too specific. It felt wrong. He wasn't a dog lover, Arthur. He was a predator. She took a deep breath and slid a local ordnance survey map across her desk, tapping a finger on a remote fenced-off patch of woodland bordering the old base. "This is where the farmer found him. Maybe you'll find something there, but for God's sake, be careful." Arthur drove his Volvo down the narrow, hedge-lined lane, Shadow sitting silently, alertly in the passenger seat. The area was desolate, marked only by a rusted chain-link fence and a faded MOD property keep-out sign. As they got out to investigate a section of the fence that had been cut and pulled back, he heard the purr of a powerful engine. The black van from the clinic appeared, blocking the lane behind his car. Two men got out. They were not thugs. They were athletic, clean-cut, and moved with an unnerving, synchronized economy. Their leader, a man with pale, watchful eyes, gave a thin, humorless smile. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice as calm and sterile as the vet's office. "A commendable effort. But this has gone on long enough. We're here to collect our property." He nodded toward Shadow. "Hand over the asset, and you can get back in your car and forget any of this ever happened." Arthur's heart hammered in his chest. He looked at Shadow, who had positioned himself squarely between Arthur and the men, his hackles raised, a low, constant growl vibrating through the damp air. "He is not property," Arthur said, his own voice a reedy tremor. "He is my dog." The second man raised a small black device. A piercing high-frequency tone, inaudible to Arthur, split the air. Shadow yelped a raw sound of pure agony and staggered, shaking his head as if trying to dislodge a hornet from his ear. In that moment, something snapped in Arthur Finch. The quiet, gentle archivist vanished, replaced by a surge of pure protective fury. He grabbed a heavy fallen tree branch, swinging the waterlogged piece of oak with all his might. He roared a sound of pure rage and smashed the sonic device from the man's hand, sending it shattering against the tarmac. The other man, the leader, lunged forward, but Shadow, recovering with astonishing speed, met the attack. He didn't bite. He launched himself forward, a cannonball of fur and muscle, slamming his body into the man's legs and knocking him off balance. The first man, shaking his numbed hand, reached inside his jacket and pulled out a taser, its electric prongs sparking menacingly in the fading light. Before the man could aim the taser, the roar of a different engine tore through the standoff. A battered, mud-splattered Land Rover Defender hurtled down the lane, its horn blaring a frantic, continuous blast. The driver's side window was down, and Clara leaned out her face, a mask of grim determination. "Arthur, get in now!" she screamed. The two men were momentarily stunned by the sudden arrival of the cavalry. It was the only opening they would get. Arthur scrambled towards the Land Rover, calling for Shadow, who broke off his standoff and bounded after him. He threw open the passenger door, and dog and man tumbled inside. The men in black recovered, moving to block the Land Rover, but Clara was a woman who knew her vehicle. She wrenched the wheels, spun the tires in the muddy verge, and swerved through a wide, pre-existing gap in the dilapidated MOD fence, crashing through overgrown brush and onto the grounds of the abandoned base itself. The black van, too wide for the gap, screeched to a halt before giving chase along the perimeter, looking for another way in. "I had a bad feeling," Clara shouted over the engine's roar as she navigated the rutted tracks of the old base. "When you didn't answer your phone, I thought they might have found you, safe for the moment parked in the shadow of a crumbling Nissan hut." Clara turned off the engine, and the truth finally came out. "My father was a senior biotechnician here," she confessed, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. "This wasn't just a research base, Arthur. This was Project Aegis." The name meant nothing to Arthur, but the story she told chilled him to the bone. Project Aegis was a top-secret, morally ambiguous program to create the ultimate canine soldier. They weren't just training German shepherds, they were enhancing them, using neural implants to increase their intelligence, problem-solving abilities, and physical strength. The device in Shadow, she explained, wasn't just a tracker. It was the interface, the core of his augmented mind. The project was officially shut down 10 years ago after an incident. Clara continued, her voice heavy with inherited shame. The official report said the animals were too unstable, too difficult to control. They were all supposed to have been euthanized, decommissioned. She looked at Shadow, who was now scanning their surroundings with an intense, focused gaze, as if the very air of the place was familiar to him. "My father never believed it. He thought the best of them, the most successful subjects, weren't destroyed. He believed They were sold to a private military contractor, a ruthless outfit called Stryker Global Security. A horrifying understanding dawned on Arthur. The men in black, the advanced technology. They don't just want the dog back, he said aloud. No, Clara affirmed grimly. He escaped from them. That implant, it's a black box. It will have recorded everything he saw, everything he did. Whatever he was involved in, the evidence is inside his head. They aren't trying to recover their property. They're trying to destroy a witness. They heard the sound of the van's engine again, closer this time. They had found another way in. Clara slammed the Land Rover into gear and sped towards the largest structure on the base, a vast cavernous aircraft hangar. They can't follow us in there with the van, but they'll be on foot soon. Inside the echoing darkness of the hangar, a silence fell between them. Arthur looked at Shadow. The dog was no longer the broken, sad creature from the shelter. He was alert, poised, his intelligence a palpable force. This was his world. Then Arthur looked at Clara, her face set with worry and resolve. Finally, he looked at his own trembling hand stained with dirt and oil. His quiet life of books and roses was over. It had vanished the moment he looked into a lonely dog's eyes. He was no longer a grieving retiree. He was the protector of a fugitive, an ally to a whistleblower's daughter, and an enemy of a powerful, shadowy corporation. He had passed a point of no return. He met Clara's gaze, the archivist's mind, for the first time in his life, looking not to the past, but to the immediate, dangerous future. What Arthur asked, his voice steady and clear, "Do we do now?" The hangar became their fortress. Arthur, whose life had been spent organizing information, found a new, desperate application for his skills. He saw not a derelict building, but a system of defensible spaces. Working with Clara, they transformed the cavernous space. They dragged rusted engine hoists, heavy metal lockers, and sheets of corrugated iron to create choke points and barricades. It was a physical exertion Arthur hadn't experienced in decades, and he felt a strange, invigorating sense of purpose. Shadow was their chief strategist. Freed in an environment that resonated with his core programming, he was a different being. He moved through the gloom with innate understanding, identifying weak points in the hangar's structure, nosing at loose floor panels that hid utility access, and leading them with a low whine to a locked maintenance tunnel in the far corner, a potential escape route. He was their guide, their guardian, their silent four-legged commander. Outside, their pursuers, led by the cold-eyed operative, whose name they later learned was Pierce, were methodical. They didn't storm the hangar. They laid siege. The first sign was the sudden death of the emergency lights, plunging them into a near-total darkness, broken only by the thin moonlight filtering through grimy upper windows. Then a voice amplified by a bullhorn echoed through the cavernous space. It was Pierce. "Clara Bennett," the voice boomed unnervingly calm. "We know who you are. We have your father's files, all of his questionable work for Project Aegis, his unsanctioned theories, his private logs. Surrender the asset, and his legacy remains intact. Resist, and the world will know him as a monster." The threat struck home. Arthur saw Clara flinch as if physically hit. This was no longer just about a dog. It was about her family, her father's name. The stakes had been brutally, personally raised. As the hours crept by in the cold and dark, a heavy despair began to settle on Arthur. He was 70 years old, a civilian armed with nothing but a newfound, terrified courage. He looked at Clara grimly, trying to figure out the mechanics of a flare gun she'd found in an old emergency kit. He looked at Shadow, who lay calmly at his feet, a warm, reassuring presence in the oppressive dark. Arthur thought of Eleanor, of his quiet life, and a wave of hopelessness washed over him. He had brought this danger upon them all. Maybe we should just give it to them, Clara? He whispered the words, tasting like ash. He's just a dog. We can't win this. Clara turned to him, her eyes fierce in the gloom. When my father knew they were shutting down the project, he wrote in his logs that Aegis had a fundamental flaw. The implants made the dog smarter, stronger, yes, but they also amplified their capacity for loyalty. They formed unbreakable singular bonds. That's why the project was deemed unstable. They wouldn't switch allegiance. She gestured to the dog at his feet. Shadow wasn't just found Arthur. He escaped, and he chose you. He trusts you. Are you going to prove him wrong? As she spoke, Shadow nudged his wet nose into Arthur's palm, a simple, profound gesture of faith. Something within Arthur, something he thought had died with Eleanor, rekindled. Resolve, hot and clear, burned away the despair. This was his bond to protect. And then a memory sparked. An engineer to the core, Eleanor had once been commissioned by a historical society to archive the original blueprints for the RAF Blackwood base. He had helped her for weeks, poring over schematics for power conduits and generator substations. He knew this place, not as a soldier, but as an archivist. The generator, he said, his voice alive with a sudden, desperate hope. There's an emergency generator in a sub-level control room. I know where it is. A plan audacious and terrifying began to form. They would use the maintenance tunnel Shadow had found. They would get to the control room, restore power, but not all of it. They would overload specific circuits, create diversions, chaos, and noise, and use the confusion to escape. Miles away, Dr. Eris Thorne, increasingly worried after his calls to Arthur went unanswered, made a choice. He pulled up the contact for a journalist he knew, a tenacious reporter who specialized in sniffing out scandals in the shadowy world of private defense contractors. I have something you might be interested in, Eris began. It starts with a dog. The hangar erupted into a symphony of controlled chaos. As Pierce and two of his team finally breached the main doors, moving with silent predatory confidence, they were met not with resistance, but with a calculated pandemonium. Deep within the hangar's guts, Arthur, his hands moving with the remembered certainty of his archival work, slammed a heavy breaker switch. Lights flickered on and off in a disorienting strobe 50 yards from the intruders. A massive, long-dormant industrial ventilation fan roared to life, its huge blades creating a deafening whirlwind of dust and sound. Alarms, shrill and discordant, blared from a different section entirely. Pierce's team, their senses overwhelmed, instinctively moved toward the largest disturbance, the fan. It was the diversion Arthur had planned. While the Stryker team was drawn away, Arthur, Clara, and Shadow navigated the maintenance tunnels emerging near a secondary loading bay on the far side of the hangar. Freedom was a dozen yards away. But as they broke from the shadows, a figure stepped into their path. It was Pierce. He hadn't taken the bait. He stood there, a silhouette against the moonlit opening, a pistol held steady in his hand. He had anticipated their route. "It's over," he said, his voice flat. In that split second, Clara reacted. She raised the flare gun and fired. A searing red projectile shot past Pierce's head, its magnesium glare momentarily turning night into a blinding, painful day. Pierce flinched, his vision obliterated. It was the only opening Shadow needed. He lunged. It wasn't the frenzied attack of a panicked animal, but a beautiful, terrible tactical strike. A blur of black and tan, he didn't go for the throat. He slammed his full body weight into Pierce's right knee, the sickening crack of bone echoing in the hangar. As the man buckled, Shadow's powerful jaws clamped down not on flesh, but on the wrist of his gun hand. With a violent, expert twist of his head, he tore the pistol from Pierce's grasp, sending it skittering across the concrete. Pierce went down screaming in pain and fury, incapacitated but alive. At that precise moment, the hangar was flooded with flashing blue and red lights. Tires screeched on the tarmac outside. The journalist Dr. Thorne had contacted had done more than just listen. He had made a call to his own source inside the Ministry of Defense Police. Armed officers swarmed the hangar, apprehending Pierce's disoriented team with swift efficiency. The siege was over. In the quiet, sterile aftermath, MOD officials in severe suits took control. The story came out in pieces from Arthur's shaky testimony, from Clara's grief-stricken but resolute account, and most damningly, from the device itself. A team of military specialists, the successors to Project Aegis, carefully removed the implant from Shadow. Its data core was intact, containing encrypted logs, coordinates, and video evidence of Stryker Global's illegal continuation of the program, using the dogs for corporate espionage and assassinations. The incident that had supposedly shut down the project was revealed to be a fiction. The program had simply been privatized. Clara's father, his old logs now seen in a new light, was posthumously hailed as a whistleblower who had tried to stop it. Arthur Finch returned to his stone cottage. The black van was gone, the threat extinguished, but the silence he had once dreaded was gone too. Shadow, free from the implant that had been both his power and his prison, was transformed. The ghost was gone, replaced by a dog. He was still dignified, still possessed of a deep, quiet intelligence, but now he would chase a ball with joyful, abandoned bark at the postman and sleep with a contented sigh at the foot of Arthur's bed, his head resting on his master's feet. Clara became a regular visitor, her battered Land Rover a familiar welcome sight in the driveway. Sometimes Dr. Thorne would join them, his initial professional horror having blossomed into a deep affection for the dog he had helped save. They were an unlikely pack, forged in chaos. One crisp autumn evening, Arthur sat in his study, a leather-bound book open in his lap. Shadow lay on the rug before the fireplace, his coat gleaming in the firelight. Arthur reached down his fingers, stroking the soft fur behind the dog's ears. He hadn't just adopted a dog from the shelter. He had rescued a soldier, befriended a hero, and in doing so had found his own way back to the world of the living. The silence in his home had finally been replaced not with noise, but with an unshakable peace.